From Dance, the Queen's Hand chapter. She was riding the dragon. I saw it with my own two eyes. He had said the same 100 times before, but every day that passed made it harder to believe. Her hair was afire. I saw that too. She was burning. All right, I want to demonstrate three relatively simple facts to you. First, Daenerys did not burn her hands at the end of A Dance with Dragons. Second, contrary to very popular belief, George has not denied that Dany is 100% fireproof. And C, in the books, Dany survives at least three fiery conflagrations. Caution, the following is a heresy of ice and fire. Be warned, even just considering this concept may cause you significant personal distress, and by considering this, you may be ridiculed by experts in the A Song of Ice and Fire community. But for just a moment, with an open mind, let's re examine the groupthink that surrounds Dany's fireproofiness. Let's look very closely at the text about Dany's burned hands at the end of A Dance with Dragons. And importantly, let's also hear from Sir Barristan and the Green Grace. Hands off the thumbs down button. Facts and text are incoming. To prepare you for these coconuts, I have a very short clip I want you to watch showing how George answered a generic question about the gods, the meaning of ice and fire, and the magical voice that Varys heard the day he was cut.
I don't do omniscient narrative. In other words, I'm not telling these from the viewpoint of whatever god. So when you say the fire speaks back, well, Varys says the fire speaks back when he's telling the story, which is then being retold, and it's 30 years later.
After listening to George here, let's look at magic in A Song of Ice and Fire with a very, very open mind. In my recent video, The Stolen White Sword, I have a ton of similar examples of George stressing he is always focusing on and incorporating rationality and science into his world building. I'll link the video at the end. So maybe there is no fantasy style blood magic in Game of Thrones, only quote unquote magic in the blood. This very idea has obviously been proposed before, and for my part, I want to add that Stephen King's Firestarter jumps out to me as a model of how George may be thinking. Carrie, in the book, received powerful TK genes from both her parents, amplifying her powers. Anyway, go back to 1998. Martin, discussing his first A Song of Ice and Fire book, stressed Targaryens are not immune to fire. Here's the quote. Some fans are reading too much into the scene in A Game of Thrones where the dragons are born, which is to say, it was never the case that all Targaryens are immune to all fire at all times. This statement by George, coupled with the general notion from the text that Dany is not immune to flames unless there is a blood magic ritual happening, closes the case for most book commentators, I guess. But doesn't George's statement beg at least one question? Is it ever the case that some special Targaryens are 100% fireproof? For most, this question doesn't even matter. Don't we all know Dany's hands were burned by pulling a molten spear from Drogon during the eastern climax of A Dance with Dragons? Consider the following quote from Dance, Dany 10. The rocks had scraped her hands raw. They were better than they were, though, she decided as she picked at a broken blister. Her skin was pink and tender, and a pale, milky fluid was leaking from her cracked palms. But her burns were healing. So Dany herself reports her hands have been burned. But wait, the situation is a bit more complex. In what's titled the Queen's Hand chapter that immediately precedes Dany's 10th chapter, Sir Barristan reports the following about the day his queen fled Moraine. She was riding that dragon. I saw it with mine own two eyes. He had said the same 100 times before, but every day that passed made it harder to believe. Her hair was afire. I saw too. She was burning. So, only her hands are really burned? Especially the palms? Think about the first Dany quote I read above and how it refers specifically, and on close inspection, only to her hands. This seems very strange in light of what Barristan described. Why isn't more of her burned? Further, consider what Dany recounts about the day. Quote, Drogon roared full in her face, his breath hot enough to blister skin. With a hiss, he spat black fire down at her. And even more, think about what the Green Grace remembers to sell me. We saw her burning that day in the pit. Even she was not safe from Drogon's wrath. Dany definitely survived a second fiery conflagration other than Drogo's pyre that day in the pit, and she survived without damage to her skin. And also take note, Dany's downplaying comes on the very next page of Dance after the Green Graces recounting we just discussed, as if George wants us to compare the two somewhat conflicting ideas. And file for later how it sometimes seems George is putting juxtapositions and connecting ideas between consecutive chapters, paragraphs, and even lines. I think there's a good chance her hands are not burned in the traditional sense, not burned from pulling the molten spear from Drogon. Even you couch sitting millennials know if you spend 2 minutes raking leaves in the fall and forget to wear gloves, your hands are blistered for days. Sam learns the lesson in Feast when practicing archery. Here's the text. When he wore his gloves, he could never hit anything, but when he took them off, he got blisters on his fingers. From Dunk and Egg, another example of Martin thinking about hand blisters. The end of the afternoon saw the lot of them all bruised and battered, with fresh blisters rising on their calloused hands from where they had gripped the spears. Now stick with me for a moment. I think Dany's hands are blistered from using the whip on Drogon. She's really going to town with the whip on him. Here's the quote. Dany hit him. No, she screamed, swishing the lash with all of her strength that she had in her. The dragon jerked his head back. No, she screamed again. No. The barbs raked along his snout. Drogon rose, his wings covering her in shadow. Dany swung the lash at his scaled belly, back and forth, until her arm began to ache. His long serpentine neck like an archer's bow. With a hiss, he spat black fire down at her. Dany darted underneath the flames, swinging the whip and shouting, No, 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 get down. His answering roar was full of fear and fury, full of pain. In another quote from Barristan, he recalls the scene and again remembers Daenerys' burning hair. Her hair was aflame. She had the whip in her hand, and she was shouting. Then she was on the dragon's back, flying. The sand that Drogon stirred as he took wing had stung Sir Barristan's eyes. But through a veil of tears, he had watched the beast fly from the pit, his black wings slapping at the shoulders of the bronze warriors at the gates. To repeat briefly, her hair was aflame. Dany confirms this hair burning in her final chapter when she tries to make a hat and when she is attacked by ants. Here's one of the quotes. She ran a hand across her stubbly scalp where her hair had burned away and felt more ants on her head, and one crawling down the back of her neck. Dany's clothes were hardly more than rags and offered little warmth. One of her sandals had slipped off during her wild flight from Marine, and she had left the other up by Drogon's cave, preferring to go barefoot rather than half shod. Her tokar and veils she had abandoned in the pit, and her linen undertunic had never been made to withstand the hot days and cold nights of the Dothraki Sea. Dany thinks back to Drogo's funeral pyre in the Game of Thrones. The fire had burned away my hair, but elsewise it did not touch me. It had been the same in Daznak's pit. To restate this quote, the fire did not touch me. So this is two undeniable times Dany has basically been proven fireproof. And it's harder to use the text to support the blood magic idea for her survival of the dragon flames in Daznak's pit. So on to Dany's third trial by fire. Let's travel back in the story to Quarth and Dany's escape from the House of the Undying. How true to the text did the Game of Thrones TV show actually portray the book scene? I think you may be very surprised. From Clash, Dany 4. But then black wings buffeted her around the head, and a scream of fury cut the indigo air. And suddenly the visions were gone, ripped away, and Dany's gasp turned to horror. The Undying were all around her, blue and cold, whispering as they reached for her, pulling, stroking, tugging at her clothes, touching her with their cold, dry hands, winding their fingers through her hair. All the strength had left her limbs. She could not move. Even her heart had ceased to beat. She felt a hand on her bare breast, twisting her nipple. Teeth found the soft skin of her throat. A mouth descended on one eye, licking, sucking, biting. Then indigo turned to orange, and whispers turned to screams. Her heart was pounding, racing. The hands and mouths were gone. Heat washed over her skin, and Dany blinked at a sudden glare. Perched above her, The dragon spread his wings and tore at the terrible dark heart, ripping the rotten flesh to ribbons. And when his head snapped forward, fire flew from his open jaws, bright and hot. She could hear the shrieks of the Undying as they burned, their high, thin, papery voices crying out in tongues long dead. Their flesh was crumbling parchment, their bones dry wood soaked in tallow. They danced as the flames consumed them. They staggered and writhed and spun and raised blazing hands on high, their fingers bright as torches. Dany pushed herself to her feet and pulled through them. They were light as air, no more than husk, and they fell at a touch. The whole room was ablaze by the time she reached the door. Drogon, she called, and he flew to her through the fire. To restate the text, the Undying were all around her. She could hear the shrieks of the Undying as they burned. Dany pushed herself to her feet and bowled through them. An indigo turned to orange, and the whispers turned to screams. Okay, I've kind of lied here. Can't put too much stock in Dany's rendition of her experience in the Palace of Dust. Most of it has to be a blue-lipped spice trip, I think. And at the very beginning of Daenerys' very next chapter, George seems to want to drive home the idea that it was all just a dream in reality. Jiqui had braided her hair Dothraki fashion and fastened a silver bell at the end of the braid. I have won no victories, she tried telling her handmaid when the bell tinkled softly. Jiqui disagreed. You burned the Magi in their house of dust and sent their souls to hell. Obviously, this begs the question if she was amongst the undying and felt the hot wash of Drogon's breath upon her, why her hair was not burned. At least three important ideas surrounding Dany's apparent fireproofiness remain. First, George is always borrowing, and the Double Dragon X genes she seems to have mimics the double genetic mutation amplification of the TK gene Carrie got in Stephen King's Firestarter. Second, John is a total biatch when it comes to fire, and he actually seems vulnerable to it. And if R plus L does equal J, it might just be another place George is telling us the special dragon gene is carried on the X chromosome. Put differently, Rhaegar can only give his daughters one half of the Double Dragon X genetic formula. Any sons are out of luck with his Y. And lastly, if Dany does have three dragons, three fires, three mounts, could the fire, the third fire, really be during the escape from Vaes Dothrak as it is in the Game of Thrones TV show? My Stolen White Sword video has a lot of audio of George talking about fantasy versus sci-fi, and it's key to believing it's not blood magic, but magic in Dany's blood that makes her fireproof. From the Shoulders of Giants for Septa Shaena's Secrets.